Welcome everyone to Saturday. Happy weekend to everyone. What we have for today is even more news for 9.2. I like that Blizzard stayed true to their word. They went on a pause, sure, throughout Christmas, but right after we ended the holidays, we are now currently into a steady stream of news and additional changes for 9.2. So that's pretty entertaining to follow, to go over all the changes. What we have for today is two quite powerful trinkets are going to be nerfed for 9.2. We're also getting some more transparency, some more communication from Blizzard when it comes to some of the tier set changes for Death Knight, as well as, the more important, the news about the drop rate and how faster you will be able to get your tier sets in 9.2. Let's start with the more player power centric change, which are the trinkets. So these, as I said, are two quite popular trinkets. One of them particularly has been the popular trinket for the entire expansion, which is, ironically, the Instructor's Divine Bell, which is a random item from the open world activities from the game. It's not even about Mythic Plus, it's not even about raiding or a crafted trinket. It's a much lower item level trinket. You could say, sort of, is this expansion's Arcano Crystal type of trinket. So what are the news about this trinket? The news are that the mastery buff of this trinket is going to be nerfed by a whopping 40%. Now the counterweight to this nerf is that the duration is going to go from 9 to 15 seconds. So in short, the stat buff is nerfed by 40% and the duration is buffed by 66%. Honestly, as long as your cooldown lasted longer than 9 seconds anyways, it's not too bad of a miss for some of the specs compared to a Fire Mage with their 10-second long combustion. This trinket with the 9-second duration was perfect for Fire Mages and much less perfect for much longer cooldowns. The other problem as to why this trinket had to be nerfed is because, as you know, every time we go patch by patch, tier by tier, the item level of the open world stuff increases as well. It's not just the raid and the Mythic Plus content that is going to give you higher item level gear. This goes for open world as well. You know, this trinket started out as a 184 item level epic, and then it could be 194, it could be 197, 203. Currently, the highest you can get this trinket is at 213. So, before this nerf, this is what you would have been able to get in 9.2 as a 233 item level trinket. You could have gotten well over 800 mastery as a buff. Instead, now this has been scaled back to 496 for 15 seconds. So you're essentially losing some 250 mastery that you would have otherwise gotten in the exchange for a longer cooldown. What is important to know is that at the very least, Blizzard is leaving you a choice. It might turn into a quite confusing choice that they give you, but the current trinket you have is going to stay the exact same. If you loot this trinket in 9.2 is when you are going to get the new version of this trinket. So you will be able to go into 9.2 by keeping your current 213 Divine Bell with a 9-second duration. Only if you get the 213 or 220 or 233 Divine Bell version from 9.2 is going to be the nerfed version with the buffed duration. A similar treatment is going to be given to the Ticking Sack of Terror. This is a similar situation but for a different reason. Divine Bell is a very overpowered trinket, as is the proof that at 213 is still being used by some specs, despite being 40 item levels lower than other trinkets. Ticking Sack of Terror is the same because it is one of the trinkets from Tazavesh. As you know, Tazavesh caps out in the hard mode version at 233. Which means that once Tazavesh is added in the Mythic Plus pool of dungeons from 9.2 onwards, this trinket will be able to get all the way up to 278 item level. It basically is going to be able to go up at the same item level as all the other trinkets. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because the Ticking Sack of Terror is performing roughly like this. There are in the game, depending on the spec you are playing, 3 to 4 trinkets that are overperforming this Tazavesh trinket. The problem is that these trinkets are overperforming it because they are 20 item levels higher, 19 to be exact. This is what would happen if you put all of these trinkets at the same item level. This is the actual value of ticking sack of terror compared to all the other trinkets. So this is why in 9.2, since the trinket will be able to be at the same item level of all the rest, it's gonna get nerfed by 24% in its damage proc. So these are the two standout nerfs to items up to this point. When it comes to trinkets, we also have some more changes. This time around is a few words from the devs. As I pointed out, they are being more transparent, more clear in their communication for the tier set changes that they have announced for Death Knights. They announced the one for Unholy, and they pretty much said, all good. You know, we are happy with the change. It seems to have been well received as well. So the only tiny thing they are planning to do for Unholy is the change to make the 2-piece only stack harvest time on Scourge Strikes and Glowing Shadows that cause Festering Wounds to burst. This was the problem that we highlighted when we first went over the first changes to this tier set, which was that if every 5 Glowing Shadows you get an Army of the Dead Ghoul for 15 seconds, you might push for a degenerate gameplay where all you do is spam Scourge Strikes because you want to spawn Army of the Dead Ghouls. Instead, now they are gating this proc behind requiring Festering Wounds to be burst with Scourge Strike. There is also a change to Blood Decay. When we went over the first round of changes, Blood was being left behind. They changed Frost and Unholy, but they said they were still working on Blood Death Knight. One of the major points of contention for the tier set of Blood was their 4-piece set bonus. This is because their 4-piece said that parrying an attack causes your weapon to lash out, her striking your attacker. And this was a problem because, of course, depending on the content, it had wild differences in value. If you are on single target on a boss, or if you are in Mythic Plus pulling 15 enemies, the amount of parries you're going to perform are, of course, much different. Also, there is the problem of spell damage, casts, spell casts. This set piece was effectively worthless because spell casts cannot be parried by a Death Knight, so it was making it much weaker. Instead, they changed the whenever you parry an attack into whenever you take damage, your weapon has a chance equal to your parry chance to lash out, her striking your attacker. So now they made it even better and more smooth for all types of damage, not just physical damage that you can parry, and also the different types of content between Mythic Plus and multiple targets and raid encounters and generally just one boss. Lastly, as they themselves say, the bad news. The bad news is that they were thinking about implementing a new Frost Death Knight 2-piece set bonus. They wanted to move away from a quite boring 8% critical chance when you add Remorseless Winter into a set bonus which gave you a 15% chance to grant Killing Machine whenever you gained a rune. Consuming Killing Machine increases your strength by 2% for 6 seconds. Apparently, their problem with this is that the proposed bonus we talked about last time has proven to be a lot more difficult to implement than we would have hoped. And considering that Frost already has a functional and balanced 2-piece before this one, it's been hard to prioritize solving it over focusing our efforts and dev time on more critical elements of the patch. So, TLDR, they are putting on hold this possible change for Frost Death Knight given that they are already doing fine with their older 2-piece and they are only going to touch it later on if they have some spare time to work on it. These were the mentions of the further tuning for set bonuses, this time all centered around Death Knight. Now, as for the last bit of news of the video, it's an important bit of news because it's about loot. It's about gearing up. This time around, the news is about the loot you will be getting from the raid. We already talked about the importance of getting your tier set and how it's gonna come. There's gonna be 5 different bosses with all the 5 different pieces for all armor types. They will drop from the same boss. So the hands of cloth, leather, plate and mail tier sets will all be dropping from Lihuvim, etc, etc. We also highlighted how important it's going to be to get your tier set pieces in normal or in heroic before you get into mythic, because 3 of the set pieces are going to be from bosses very deep in the raid. Handuin being the 8th boss, Lords of Dread being the 9th boss, and Rigelon being the 10th boss. So before you get to those bosses in mythic, for the mythic tier piece, it's going to be a while. So it's going to be very important for you to loot them in normal or heroic. But the new piece of news is that now, seemingly, bosses who drop tier pieces are going to drop it as extra loot. So every boss normally has 4 items given to you. Just assume you're also playing in 20 man in heroic or normal. They drop 4 items. When you defeat one of these 5 bosses that drop a tier set, they will be dropping 8. 4 normal pieces from their normal loot table, and then 4 guaranteed, 100% certain pieces of tier set. This means, in very short, that with 5 bosses dropping 4 pieces each, every raid will loot 20 tier set pieces. Pretty nice coincidence considering that a mythic raid is going to have 20 players. The speed of which you can gear up your tier sets is going to be 1 piece per player per raid clear in Mythic, for example, or if you have 20 players in Heroic, for example. This would, of course, significantly speed up the process of gearing up your characters. Before, thinking about the number of loot available for each boss and thinking that it wasn't guaranteed for you to drop a tier piece, you only had maybe 1 or at best 2 tier pieces dropping from one of these bosses. Instead, now you have 4 guaranteed ones, not to mention that you still need the rest of your gear and you can still drop 4 normal pieces. Trinkets, rings, weapons, cloaks and whatnot are still going to be dropping, so the speed in which you will be able to gear up your characters is going to be much faster than we have previously seen, both in Sanctum of Domination and in Castelnatria. The sheer quantity of loot in Sepulcher of the first one seems to be quite increased, and the whole process of gearing up seems to have been sped up. This is not even mentioning the slight extra advantage of being able to equip 2 legendaries, which means effectively you will need 1 less piece of gear to gear up because it's going to be taken by the legendary slot, and also the fact that the tier pieces are in fixed slots and they are going to be guaranteed drops from bosses. So you already have, before even starting 9.2, you already know that your hands, your pants, your helm, your shoulders and your chest will be from the tier set, or at least 4 of them out of 5, plus an extra slot for your first legendary and a second slot for your second legendary. So nearly half of your gear is going to be fixed in place. It might be a little bit disappointing because it's not going to allow you to play with secondary stats. You won't really have many choices for your best in slot secondary stats when you have to equip tier set loot, but on the bright side, it's going to be faster. It's going to be easier and quicker to get stronger gear this way. Now, we still have to reiterate, as the last point of these news, reiterate the point about the speed difference depending on the quantity of classes you have. Because what was also unearthed from the PTR is that the loot is tradable. It has no difference from a normal piece of loot. If you loot it and you have at least an equivalent item level piece in that slot, you can trade it. This causes a problem, as we said already the first time we looked at the tier sets. What if your raid has a Prot Paladin, 2 Holy Paladins and 1 Ret Paladin and only 1 Unholy Death Knight? This means that out of these 5 tier set bosses, 20 pieces are gonna come out, 20 pieces of tier set are gonna be looted, and every one of these bosses is going to have 4 different Paladins possibly eligible to loot this tier set and just 1 Unholy Death Knight. This is going to make it much faster for the Paladins to move around their tier set, because they will loot it multiple times, they will loot other equivalent item level gear, which means they will be able to trade it, they will be able to pass it around themselves. Meanwhile, the Unholy Death Knight will just have to hope that he gets lucky and he's the one who loots the actual tier set. So this is going to create quite a discrepancy between the least played and the most played specs in a raid. Just looking at the raid compositions, specs like Paladins, specs like Shamans, as far as DPS, having more than 1 is going to be very likely for things like mages, things like hunters, perhaps warlocks will likely be advantaged by this system, and then the more niche specs or classes altogether will be less likely. Ironically enough, Demon Hunter will not be that advantaged. If you consider the drop of popularity of Vengeance Demon Hunters, it's likely just gonna be 1 Havoc in the raid, perhaps a couple of Havoc in the raid. Same goes for Death Knights. It's quite unlikely to see more than 1 DPS Death Knight in a raid. Probably the same thing goes for Rogues, same goes for Windwalker Monks, given how Mistweavers are not as popular. So it seems like we are going to see quite some differences in the speed of gearing up for tier sets for the different classes based on their popularity, as long as this type of loot distribution without a token remains in place. Now we are finishing the video by saying that of course everything we just said and we just seen is on the PTR. So it might change, perhaps even within the next 24 hours. Perhaps Blizzard says, whoops, sorry guys, we said 4 tier pieces per boss, we actually meant 4 tier pieces per raid clear. Whoops. You know, maybe they're gonna change, maybe something is gonna be tuned later, but for now, this is what we have. And as far as the quantity they have decided to go for, when it comes to the tier sets, it's a very, very good choice. It's a very, very positive change, especially if you go back to Sanctum of Domination and you remember, perhaps some of your friends, guildmates, and the time it took for them to get all of the pieces of socketed domination gear. You know, some guys were lucky and they got them all in the first week between normal and heroic. Others took 4 resets, 5 resets sometimes to get their gear plus their shards. So with this proposed system giving you 20 tier sets per raid clear, not to mention you can do this in heroic and then in normal, which is going to be 40 tier sets per clear, is actually going to make it quite easy for you in the long run, even in the first 3 or so weeks, to get everyone with their tier sets available. So definitely a positive change, provided it stays this way before we get to live in 9.2. Now that we have done with looking at the changes for today, for this Saturday, we can leave each other to the rest of our weekend. As usual, guys, thank you for watching the video, which also means supporting the channel. So if you want to continue to do so, you can leave a like on the video as per what YouTube wants. Same goes for commenting down below. You can let one of your pets walk on the keyboard and say something if you don't know what to say. And then, of course, you can also subscribe to the channel. But this time only for the poor guys who already know they're going to be the lone class in their raid and it's gonna take them 3 months to get their tier set. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I don't know, it seems too good to be true, honestly. I'm a little bit skeptical. Maybe Blizzard genuinely made a mistake and didn't want to give us 4 pieces per boss, but now they are afraid if they revert it, people are gonna get too mad. That would be hilarious.